Hey, what's going on, Common Good family? Hope you're doing well. We are back in the studio. So excited to share with you this morning, or whatever time of the day you're watching this. Hey, if you're new to this experience, new to this community, my name is Royce, one of the pastors here, and just so honored that you would choose to spend your Sunday morning with us. We are a Jesus community that believes the church exists for the common good and for the benefit and the flourishing of all people and all persons, no matter their race, their ethnicity, their age, their gender identity, sexual orientation, physical or mental ability, socioeconomic status, or even spiritual background. And so, hey, we just want you to know that whatever your story, whatever your background, wherever you might be on your spiritual journey, you're welcome here. We love you, and we hope that you'll be blessed and encouraged today. In fact, if there's anything that we could do to serve you and get you connected to the life of this community, would you let us know? You can fill out our digital connect card at commongood.church/connect. Well, I just want to jump right in this morning. So if you have your Bibles, go with me right now to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14 is where we want to spend our morning. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 in particular, or 22 through 33, I should say. And let me read this for us. It says, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance, somebody say distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed back into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." I want to continue today in a brand new collection of talks that we kicked off a couple weeks ago entitled Faith for the Middle. One of the things that we're acknowledging in the season is that if we're honest with ourselves, the reality is much of life can often feel like we're living somewhere in the middle, right? We're not where we used to be, but we're certainly not where we want to be or thought we would be or hoped we would be. Many of us, we find ourselves in this liminal in-between space between point A and point B, right? Having left our previous destination, en route to our next intended destination, but for whatever reason, we find ourselves a little stuck, caught in the middle. And as a result, we have yet to arrive at the other side. And the truth is, experiencing life in the middle can be hard and difficult and frustrating, demoralizing and exhausting, so much so that many of us have perhaps even considered quitting and throwing in the towel and giving up altogether. And maybe some of us were in that season right now, right? You left one opportunity for another, one job for another, one career for another, one business for another, one relationship for another, one church, one ideology, one theological conviction for another. You've left something for something else, but for whatever reason, you have yet to reach the other side. You're stuck, caught somewhere in the middle. Such was the case with the 12 disciples when we get to our story in Matthew chapter 14, right? Jesus just finishes performing this incredible miracle, the feeding of the 5,000 with just 2 fish and 5 loaves. Really, it was like 10,000, 15,000 if you include the women and the kids. Jesus finishes wrapping things up, so he sends his disciples on ahead of him on a boat to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And the story tells us that while the disciples are a considerable distance from the shore that they had just left en route to the other side, they encounter a massive storm. And as a result, what we discover is that what should have only taken them really 1 to 2 hours max to cross over to the other side to get there to their intended destination, that they find themselves some 9 hours later, still rowing. The wind and the waves crashing into the boat, and they're not making any progress. They find themselves stuck in the middle of a storm and in the middle of the sea. But here's what I love about the story, is that right when they're about to quit, right when they're about to throw in the towel, Jesus shows up in the middle, in the 9th hour, in the 11th hour, so to speak, in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the sea, when it feels like all hope is lost and when they're about ready to call it quits, Jesus shows up. And because Jesus shows up, Peter experiences a miracle right there in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the sea. Peter gets up out of that boat and starts walking on water. Can you imagine? Peter has this walk on water moment right there in the middle, and Peter's never the same again. And what we discover from the story is that all it took for Peter to experience this life-changing, life-altering miracle right in the middle of the storm, right in the middle of the sea, was just a little bit of faith. Not a lot of faith, just a little bit. And so the question that we've been asking ourselves as a community is, well, how can we have faith like Peter for the middle? So that we too can experience a walk on water moment, so that we too can experience some miracles even in the middle. And so this is a journey that we've been on. This is the conversation that we're having, that we're going to be having over the next several weeks. We're literally just sitting in the story and reading it and rereading it over and over again each week, inviting God's Spirit to show us and to reveal to us what it might look like to have faith even for the middle. And how we're doing each week is we're honing in on specific verses within the story and kind of just going chronologically from top to bottom. And from these verses, the hope is that we can extract and uncover and unpack different principles and lessons and insights from the text that might actually help us. Those of us who find ourselves in the middle might help us actually have some faith for the middle, so that we too can experience some walk on water moments. And so today what I want to do is I want to hone in on verses 22 through 24 from our story this morning. And I want to preach to you today from this thought, this topic, this idea. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. When God seems distant. When God seems distant. Has God ever seemed or felt distant to you? Do you know what I'm talking about? Right? Have you ever had a time or season in your life where maybe God didn't seem as close and as intimate and as present and as approximate to you as other times in your life? Where maybe you've experienced some seasons in your life where it seems like your prayers are going unanswered. It almost feels like there's this ceiling between you and God and nothing's getting through, right? You're not seeing God move. You're not seeing God work in your life like God used to. You're not hearing God's voice. You can't feel God's presence. Like God seems a little absent, a little silent. And you start to even wonder to yourself, has God abandoned me? Like, has God forgotten about me? Right? Do you know what I'm talking about? You know the feeling? I want to suggest this morning that I think oftentimes when we find ourselves in the middle, in between point A and point B, not where we used to be, but certainly not yet where we want to be. I think it's oftentimes in the middle, when we feel stuck in the middle, that God can especially feel and seem a little distant. Now, to be fair, right, God seeming or feeling distant can sometimes be a result of our own doing, our own volition, right? We at times are the ones that we want to distance ourselves from God. Maybe we're mad at God, we're disappointed at God, and so we're like, God, forget you, I got this, I can do this on my own, I don't need you, right? And so we want to go our separate ways. We part ways and we tell God, leave me alone, I don't need you, I want you in my life right now. But other times, isn't it true? That we actually want God in our lives. We want God to show up in our middle, don't we? We actually want God's help. But yet for some reason, every time we ask for God's help, God seems a little silent. God seems a little absent. God seems a little distant. We're like, God, I'm stuck here in the middle. I need some help. You know, I'm in the middle of a storm. Like, what should I do? God, I need a job. Can you help me get that new job? I've been working really hard for that promotion. Can you help me get the promotion? God, you know how much I want a significant other in my life. You know how much I want a life partner. God, can you help me find the one? But all we get is silence. No response. No answer. God seems distant. God seems absent. And so you can't start to help but to wonder to yourself, God, are you even out there? Are you even listening? Do you hear me? Have you forgotten about me? God, do you care? Do you love me? Love me? God, are you even real? Right? Have you ever been there? You find yourself in the middle. You want God's help. You want God's presence. But yet God is nowhere to be found. You can't see God. You can't feel God. You can't hear God. God feels and seems distant. And the truth is, can we be real? Can we be honest? It's hard to have faith when God seems distant, isn't it? It's hard to have some faith in a God that doesn't seem to hear you. It's hard to have some faith in a God that doesn't seem to show up when you need God the most. It's hard to have some faith in a God that doesn't seem to answer your prayers and that seems absent and that perhaps has even forgotten you. It's hard to have a faith in that kind of God, isn't it? It's hard to have faith in a God where you're not even sure that God is real anymore because you don't see, hear, or feel God at all. And so, church, what do we do? What do we do when we find ourselves in the middle and God seems distant? Well, what are we supposed to do when we find ourselves in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the sea, but God is nowhere to be seen, heard, or found? How do we have faith for the middle when God seems distant? How do we have faith for the middle when God seems absent? How do we have faith for the middle when God seems silent? Can I offer, for the remainder of this time, this morning, the next few minutes, can I offer just 2 suggestions this morning, 2 principles, 2 thoughts, 2 ideas, whatever you want to call them, that perhaps we can extract from our text this morning as we conclude our time, that I think might actually help us answer that question. Like, what might Scripture be trying to teach us about how to have faith for the middle, especially when God seems distant? Well, the first thing is this, first suggestion. And you can write this down if you're taking notes. Number 1 is this. We need to recognize that sometimes the distance is intentional. We need to recognize that sometimes the distance is intentional. My oldest son, Jaden, he's into basketball and he's actually a pretty good player, but he struggles a lot with confidence, self-confidence and believing in himself, and kind of goes up and down. And at the beginning of this fall season, his team got some new players that are also pretty good. And it kind of messed, I think, a little bit with the equilibrium and his confidence, because all last season he was like the best player of the team. And now he's got some other great players. He's not sure how to like respond and how to react. And because I'm that dad that usually stays and watches practices, I actually saw firsthand what was happening. First couple practices, I could tell he was struggling. He wasn't playing like his usual self, right? He's being more timid, passing up shots, not being aggressive. And so when I noticed he was struggling, we had a little talk after practice. And out of that talk, one of the things that became apparent was that what wasn't really helping the situation was also the fact that I was there watching him. And he was feeling this additional pressure from me to perform by just me being at practice. And so we made a deal. We said, okay, here's the deal. I'm not going to come watch your practices for a little while. And here's why. Because I just want to give you the space for you just to do you, where you don't have to worry about me. Like, I want you just to have the space in the room to kind of work things out and get your swag back, get your confidence back, and to grow and develop on your own. And so what I did was I stopped going to those practices. I distanced myself. Church, can I suggest that sometimes God distances God's self from us on purpose, for a reason, for our good. Sometimes the distance, church, is intentional. I think this is exactly what we see Jesus doing with our verses this morning with the disciples, right? Verse 22 tells us that immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of them to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So immediately what we see is that there's distance and separation being created between Jesus and the disciples. Jesus stays to dismiss the crowds, and the disciples go and they get on a boat. Which, by the way, for the disciples, what it means for them is that they didn't just see, that Jesus didn't just seem or feel distant. Jesus literally was actually physically distant from the disciples. But here's what's interesting. This is what I find interesting. Look what it says in verse 23. Verse 23 says that after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And later that night, he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance. Somebody say distance. Distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Now, this is where like the story gets a little weird and confusing for me. Like, this is what I'm a little baffled by. Like, I get why there's distance between Jesus and the disciples in the beginning, because Jesus had to finish his job. He's like, I got to take care of the crowds. I got to dismiss them. So he's like, let me take care of this. We all don't need to be here. So you all head out. You all take care, get to the next assignment. I'm going to catch up with you on the other side. Let me just finish tying some things up, which would suggest to us, right, that the only reason why Jesus doesn't go with them in the first place is because Jesus just had some business to take care of. He had some things to do. And so the initial distance, it makes sense, right? We all don't need to be here to dismiss the crowd, so you all go ahead of me. But here's what I find so interesting, right? You would think then, if that was the case, that after Jesus is done dismissing the crowd, what should Jesus do? Well, Jesus should actually just go and catch up to the disciples. But what do we discover instead? What we discover is that Jesus actually does the exact opposite. right? Jesus has fulfilled his duty. He dismisses the crowd, the one thing that kept him from going with the disciples in the first place. And so for any rational, logical person, you would just think that, okay, now this time you finished it, go catch up with the disciples. But instead, what does Jesus do? He actually doesn't go to them. In fact, what does Jesus do? He goes in the opposite direction. He goes away from the shore and away from the sea and away from the disciples in the boat, and he goes up instead to a mountainside to pray. Now, I get that maybe the reason why Jesus went into the mountainside is because Jesus was really tired. He needed a break. He needed to be alone. He needed to pray. And I think that's a valid point. But at the same time, I think Jesus could have just gotten to a boat all by himself, had a little QT, prayed with God, being all in a boat, and just took his time rowing out to the disciples, right? But instead, Jesus goes away from the disciples. Church, can I suggest it almost seems like Jesus is trying to create even more distance and more separation between him and his disciples. And Jesus extends the time, the length of time and the duration that Jesus is distant from the disciples, which makes me begin to think that maybe, just maybe, again, I don't know for sure, but just maybe the distance was intentional. Like, why else would Jesus not go to the disciples? But instead, why else would Jesus go up into a mountainside to pray and extend the distance and extend the duration of the time being apart? Church, can I propose that maybe the distance you're feeling, maybe it's intentional. Maybe there's a purpose. Maybe there's a reason why God sometimes seems distant and why God sometimes feels silent and why sometimes we can't see God or feel God or hear God. Maybe God's actually creating the distance and the separation for a reason. Which of course begs the question, well, what's the reason? What's the intention? What's the purpose? I mean, isn't that kind of mean, God? Like, is that really necessary? Is there another way? Like, why would you distance yourself on purpose? Why would Jesus extend his time away from the disciples? Why would Jesus leave his disciples alone in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the sea? Like, I know it seems intentional, but what's the intention? Now, again, I don't claim to know for sure all of Jesus's intention and motivation for creating more separation, more distance, and extending the duration of the separation between him and his disciples. And I don't know why sometimes God feels distant to us, and especially when we find ourselves in the middle. But I think what one of the ancient spirituals, St. John of the Cross, 16th century Spanish priest, coined as the term the dark night of the soul, I think could be helpful in us understanding perhaps what is happening here. St. John of the Cross described and understood the Christian life as a journey, which I think is a great description, right? Because a journey involves movement, it involves action, stops, starts, detours, delays, right? Trips into the unknown. And so the Christian life, I think, is much like a journey. And so St. John of the Cross describes the journey of the Christian life in three stages or three phases. The beginner's phase or stage, the progressives, and the perfect. So it's three stages of the Christian journey. And he argues that to move out of the beginning stage, right, the infant stage, actually requires the receiving of God's gift of the dark night of the soul. What is the dark night of the soul, you ask? Well, the dark night of the soul, as he describes it, is being a moment in time in our Christian lives in which God feels distant. Right? Where our good feelings of God's presence suddenly disappears. When we feel as if the door of heaven has been shut as we pray and our prayers seem to go unanswered, right? It's the moment in time in our season in the Christian journey when darkness and helplessness and weariness and a sense of failure or defeat or emptiness and dryness starts to come upon us. It's the moment when Christian disciplines and spiritual practices that served us well up until this point no longer seem to work like they used to. The worship music that you used to listen to that helped you feel connected to God in such an intimate way no longer moves you the way that it used to. It's the dark night of the soul that we can't really see what God is doing because it's so dark and we don't even know if God is even there and we don't see much progress or fruit in our lives. Church, can I suggest that sounds a lot like the middle, right? The middle often feels like the dark night of the soul, especially when God seems distant and we're left to ask and wonder to ourselves, God, are you there? Do you hear me? Do you care? Have you forgotten about me? Have Have you abandoned me? And church, it's hard to have faith during the dark night of the soul. But here's the encouragement. St. John of the Cross argues that it's actually in this very season, the dark night of the soul, when God feels most absent, when God feels most distant, that something profound is actually happening. If we can just have enough faith to stay in it long enough. Because it's tempting to quit and throw in the towel. But if we could just hang on long enough, St. John of the Cross suggests that it's in this place, in the middle of the dark night of the soul, this difficult liminal in-between space where God feels distant. He argues that three things happen. Number one, that there's a deep cleansing and purging that happens in our souls. A cleansing and purging from the idols of the world and from unhealthy attachments and false identities that we've been carrying and hiding behind. It's during the dark night of the soul when God seems distant that we actually step into a greater freedom. Freedom from the things that would prevent us from actually being and living into our true, authentic selves. Right? St. John also says that the second thing that happens in the dark night of the soul is that there's a birthing of something new that takes place. It's during the dark night of the soul that actually transformation happens. That God is actually giving birth to something new in our spirits and in our souls, that there's a growth that's happening, that God is developing something new on the inside of us during the dark night of the soul. Anyone old enough to remember taking photos, like on an actual camera, not your cell phone, not the DSLR, where you actually had to use like real film and it had to be developed, right? I'm not a photographer, but I kind of know the process, right? And to develop a film, you would have to actually put the film in what they called the dark room. And here's the thing about the dark room, is the dark room is dark. You don't see anything happening. You just kind of put the film and you just leave it alone. But here's what we discover is that even in the dark, something is happening. The film is being developed and something beautiful is being birthed. Church, can I encourage you? The dark night of the soul, the middle where God feels distant, can feel dark and lonely and difficult and hard. But can I encourage you? It's that even in this season, if you can just have enough faith to believe, I believe that something is being developed on the inside of you. God is doing a work on the inside of you. Which then leads me to the third thing. St. John of the Cross says the third thing that happens in the dark night of the soul is that it leads to a deeper connection with God. It's in the dark night of the soul, when God feels distant, that it's actually an invitation to experience a deepening of God's love and to enter into a richer and fuller communion with God. That it's in this place of the dark night of the soul that we might actually know God's true peace and God's rest, and that God is actually strengthening our souls and faith and pruning us of our dependency to need and to experience and to see God in certain ways. That we could be able to actually just trust and love God and know God, right, in new ways. It's in the dark night of the soul that our faith and our relationship with God is actually being deepened and expanded, because it's actually in the silence and the lack of God's presence that if we listen closely enough, and if we sit long enough, and if we're quiet enough, we could start to discover and hear the still small voice of God. To know that aside from the feelings and the emotions, that God is still with us and that God is still near. And if we can do that, then our lives will never be the same. In some ways, I think about the dark night of the soul as a little bit of a season in which, in some ways, God kind of just removes the training wheels. You remember the training wheels when you first started riding your bike? Right? You needed the training wheels to balance. And you needed your mom or your dad or big bro or big sister to like hold on to you as you tried to figure out how to balance the bike, right? But at some point, you had to graduate from the training wheels. At some point, your parents had to remove them. At some point, you had to learn not to depend on them. At some point, your mom and your dad had to let you go. And it was hard at first. And you fell a couple times, right? But isn't it true? Once you figured it out, once you started to ride without the training wheels, there was no going back. Why would you ever go back? Because you finally felt free. You finally felt fast. You finally felt strong. Church, here's the point. Here's my encouragement. When it comes to our Christian lives, at some point, the training wheels need to come off if we're going to grow. And if we're going to move from, as St. John on the cross would say, from beginners to progressives. Look, I know the distance is hard. I know the silence is hard. I know the unanswered prayers are hard. I know it's hard when it feels like God has abandoned you. But sometimes, church, the distance serves a purpose. Sometimes the distance is intentional. Sometimes the distance is actually for our own good, and the distance is actually transforming us. And the distance, if you and I would allow it to, is actually setting you free. It's actually making you stronger. It's actually giving birth to something new. It's actually deepening and strengthening your faith so that you no longer need the warm, fuzzy feeling to know that God loves you and that God is for you. The distance, if you would allow it, is actually an invitation into a deeper understanding of the depths of God's love and the mystery of God's goodness. In fact, think about this. If Jesus would have just went with the disciples in the boat from the get-go, from day one, from the start, if Jesus did take some time to stay apart and to create distance from the disciples, do you realize there would actually be no miracle in the middle? There would be no need for it, right? If Jesus was right there with them the whole time, then there is no miracle in the middle. There is no Jesus walking to Peter and there is no Peter walking on water moment. It's only because there was a period of time, the dark night of the soul, the extended middle in which Jesus felt distant, and then when they felt like God had forgotten them and abandoned them. It's because of the distance that actually created the very environment and the very opportunity for Peter to have an encounter with Jesus and a walk on water moment. And his life would never be the same because of it. You want to know how to have faith in the middle, even when God feels distant? Recognize that sometimes there's a purpose for the distance. The distance can be intentional. And the intent is never to harm or to hurt you, but to help you. The distance is for your good, it's for your transformation, it's for your growth and your freedom and your liberation. And if you could just learn to embrace the distance and have enough faith to stay in the distance long enough, I think you too, just like Peter, can experience a walk on water moments, and you'll never be the same. Let me give you the second one. I know I'm running out of time. First one is this. If we want to have faith for the middle, we got to recognize that sometimes the distance is intentional. Number two is this. Write this down. We need to learn to look for Jesus in the unexpected. You want to know how to have faith for the middle when Jesus or when God feels distant? You got to learn to look for Jesus in the unexpected. Church, I need you to know it's really, really important. While the distance might sometimes be intentional, the distance is never forever. The distance is never permanent. The distance is always temporary. In fact, is this not what we see in our text? Well, what do we discover? We discover that Jesus eventually shows up in the middle of their storm, in the middle of the sea. This is what verse 25 tells us, that shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake, walking on the water. Now, it took Jesus a while, and I'm sure the disciples wished Jesus had come a lot earlier, like maybe in hour 3, hour 4, out of hour 5. That would have been nice. But nonetheless, Jesus shows up in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the sea. Jesus shows up for them in the middle. And as much as Jesus' distance may have felt or made them think that Jesus had abandoned them or Jesus got busy and forgot about them, what we discover is that no, Jesus didn't forget about them. Jesus comes to them, right? But here's what I find so interesting about the story, is that when Jesus finally does show up, what do we discover? What happens? Look at verse 26. Verse 26 says, or verse 25, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out and walking on the lake. And then verse 26, when the disciples saw him, listen to this, watch this, walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Church, here's what I want to see. In other words, Jesus finally shows up. The very thing that they were probably wishing for and praying for like the past 9 hours. They were probably crying out, Jesus, show up. Jesus, we need your help. We're dying out here. We're drowning. And Jesus finally shows up in the middle. But when he does, they don't recognize him. They don't see Jesus. They mistake Jesus for a ghost. Church, I know it sounds absurd. How could they do such a thing? How could they be so stupid? Like, how could you not recognize Jesus? But I wonder, how many of us who find ourselves in the middle, who find ourselves in the dark night of the soul where it feels like God is distant, that God is silent, that God is not answering prayers, that God doesn't care, that God has abandoned us, that God has forgotten about us. And we start to even question whether or not God is even real. I wonder how many of us are praying and asking and pleading and begging for God to show up in our middle. And we're even getting frustrated and angry because God doesn't seem to answer and God doesn't seem to care and God seems so distant. But I wonder if all the while, what we don't realize is that Jesus has actually already shown up. That Jesus is actually right there walking to you in the middle of your storm, in the middle of your sea, but you just don't recognize him. You just don't see him. Church, here's what I need you to know, and I'm done. I'm bringing this to a close. Jesus will often show up when you least expect it and in ways you least expect. Jesus will often show up when you least expect it and in ways you least expect. When does Jesus show up? At dawn. When the disciples got to the point of rock bottom, when they've been rowing for 9 hours straight, when they've given up all hope. That's when Jesus shows up. Can I give you a little tip, a little hint? Jesus often shows up when we finally get to the end of ourselves. When we finally come to the realization that we actually can't do it on our own. Right? Jesus shows up when we're actually desperate enough to need him. Jesus often shows up when we stop trying to row the boat ourselves and we realize that it's actually not getting us anywhere. I wonder if 4 hours in, 5 hours in, 6 hours in, disciples are like, you know what? We're professionals. We're good. We've done this. We've seen storms out. We got this. We just got to row harder. Let's strategize a little bit. Let's switch up the oars. Maybe that's the issue, right? Church, I don't think the disciples are the only ones that do that. Don't we do that all the time? We find ourselves in the middle of a storm and we're like, I got this. I can do this if I just try a little hard, if I just strategize a little better. Let me try to fix this. Let me just try a little harder and then maybe Jesus will help me. But I wonder if instead Jesus is just waiting for you and I to put the oars down, throw up our hands and to say, you know what? I can't do this on my own. I actually need help. Jesus often shows up when you least expect it. And Jesus will often show up in ways you least expect. I mean, think about it. Who expects Jesus to come walking to them on water? They hadn't seen Jesus walk on water before. They've never seen anybody walk on water before, right? And so they think it's a ghost. I mean, after all, who else can walk on water but a ghost? But because they didn't expect it, they missed it. Right? Because they didn't expect Jesus to show up walking on water, they mistake Jesus for a ghost. They don't recognize him. You ever played the game, I think it's called Hot and Cold, right? Where you like play with some kids. We do a lot with our kids. Close your eyes. We go hide an object somewhere in the house, right? And then they open their eyes and you're like, okay, go find it. And as they go searching for it, you say hot or cold, right? As they get closer, you tell them to get hotter. They get further away, you tell them colder. And time again, it's like the funniest thing to watch, right? Literally, they will get so hot because they're literally looking at the thing that they're supposed to find, right? They're so hot that you're like, hot, 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 hot. And you're just so hot. And what's crazy is the object that they're looking for is literally right in front of their face. You're like, hot, 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 but they don't see it. Well, why don't they see it? Well, it's usually because they don't expect it to be there. Church, I wonder if Jesus is right in front of your face, but because Jesus isn't showing up in the ways that you expected him to show up, you actually can't see him. You can't recognize him. See, I think the truth is, whether or not we want to admit it or not, we all have expectations as to how we think Jesus will show up and how we want Jesus to show up, don't we? Right? We think Jesus shows up in certain ways, or we want Jesus to show up in certain ways, but I wonder if the reason we're not recognizing Jesus in the middle of your storm is because Jesus is showing up in ways you're not expecting. I wonder if Jesus is showing up in the people you would least expect. I wonder right now in your middle, Jesus is showing up in conversations you least expect. I wonder right now in your middle where it feels like Jesus is distant, I wonder if Jesus is actually showing up in the circumstances you least expect. I wonder if Jesus is showing up in your routine and in the mundane and in the little things, the places that you would least expect, but it's because you're not looking in those places. You can't see Jesus. You don't recognize him because that's not the way that you expect Jesus to show up. I think especially for those of us who grew up in the American church, the Western evangelical church in particular, right? We've been taught that Jesus shows up a certain way, right? Jesus shows up in power. Jesus shows up in authority. Jesus shows up in the White House, and Jesus shows up in whiteness, and Jesus shows up in big churches and big stages and big crowds, and Jesus shows up in the new job, in the new car, in the new house. But then when we look at Scripture, we see that Scripture teaches us a different story about how Jesus shows up. Right? That Jesus doesn't show up on planet Earth in a palace, but Jesus shows up in a manger. Jesus doesn't show up as a king, but as a baby. Jesus doesn't show up with big lights and big stages, but Jesus shows up in obscurity and poverty in an unknown middle of nowhere town called Bethlehem. Jesus doesn't show up hanging out with the religious elite, but Jesus shows up hanging out with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes. Jesus doesn't show up in Hollywood. No, Jesus shows up at the margins of society with the poor and the immigrant and the prisoner and the outcast and the forgotten and the sick. Come on, think about it. Jesus doesn't show up on a throne. Jesus shows up on a cross. Church, I wonder if you've been asking Jesus to show up in your storm and you've been crying out to God saying, God, where are you? Don't you care? Why aren't you answering my prayers? Why aren't you listening? Why are you so distant and why are you so distant and you're frustrated and you're angry? And Jesus the whole time is like, hey, I'm right here. Can you see me? Can you feel me? Can you hear me? I'm walking right at you. I'm actually standing right here in front of you. I'm right here with you in the middle, but you just can't see him. You don't recognize him because you're looking for Jesus in all the wrong places. Church, you want to know how to have faith in the middle when God seems distant? Ask yourself, what are you looking for? How are you expecting Jesus to show up? Because perhaps if you look close enough, if you look hard enough, if you look in the right places, you will discover that perhaps God is not so distant after all. Perhaps the Jesus you're looking for in the middle of your storm and in the middle of the sea is actually already right in front of you. And the question is, do you recognize him? Do you see him? Church, we've got to learn to look for Jesus in the unexpected. And if we do, we might soon discover that Jesus is actually closer than we think. Jesus is actually nearer than we realize. Jesus is actually right there with you in your middle if you would just have the eyes to see. Because it's only until we can learn to see Jesus and recognize Jesus in the middle of our storm and in the middle of the sea, it's then and only then do we get to experience the miracle of walking on water. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for the moments that we share. We thank you for the reminder this morning. We acknowledge that it's difficult and it's hard to be in the middle, especially because in the middle, so often you feel so distant. But God, I pray that you would help us to take this to heart this morning, that we would recognize that even when you do feel distant, that we can acknowledge and recognize that sometimes the distance is actually intentional. Sometimes it's for our own good and it's for our own transformation and it's for the increase of our faith. And God, I pray that you would also help us to acknowledge and recognize that perhaps you're actually closer than we think. Perhaps you're not so distant. Perhaps you're actually just right there in front of us if we would just have the eyes to see. So teach us, God, how to learn to recognize you in the unexpected so that we might actually discover for ourselves that you're actually right there with us, right there in the middle of our storm and our sea. We thank you. We love you. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, hey, I hope you enjoyed that message. We're going to be putting some questions up on the screen for you to reflect around either on your own or perhaps with some friends, family, or co-op, or even your house church. Of course, if there's anything that's on your heart, a question, something that you're needing or wanting prayer for, and you just want to talk to somebody, send us a message in confidentiality at commongood.church/prayer. Myself or one of the other pastors would love to connect with you. All right. God bless. Have an incredible week, and we'll see you real soon.